Preface to Overruled, The Alleviations of Monogamy. This piece is not an argument for or against polygamy. It is a clinical study of how the thing actually occurs among quite ordinary people, innocent of all unconventional views concerning it. The enormous majority of cases in real life are those of people in that position. Those who deliberately and conscientiously profess what are oddly called advanced views by those others who believe them to be retrograde are often, and indeed mostly, the last people in the world to engage in unconventional adventures of any kind, not only because they have neither time nor disposition for them, but because the friction set up between the individual and the community by the expression of unusual views of any sort is quite enough hindrance to the heretic without being complicated by personal scandals. Thus, the theoretic libertine is usually a person of blameless family life, while the practical libertine is mercilessly severe on all other libertines and excessively conventional in professions of social principle. What is more, these professions are not hypocritical. They are, for the most part, quite sincere. The common libertine, like the drunkard, succumbs to a temptation which he does not defend, and against which he warns others with an earnestness proportionate to the intensity of his own remorse. He or she may be a liar and a humbug, pretending to be better than the detected libertines, and clamouring for their condign punishment, but this is merely self-defence. No reasonable person expects the burglar to confess his pursuits, or refrain from joining in the cry of "Stop thief" when the police get on the track of another burglar. If society chooses to penalise candour, it has itself to thank if its attack is countered by falsehood. The clamorous virtue of the libertine is therefore no more hypocritical than the plea of not guilty which is allowed to every criminal. But one result is that the theorists who write most sincerely and favourably about polygamy know least about it, and the practitioners who know most about it keep their knowledge very jealously to themselves, which is hardly fair to the practice. Inaccessibility of the facts. Also, it is impossible to estimate its prevalence. A practice which nobody confesses may be both universal and unsuspected, just as a virtue which everybody is expected under heavy penalties to claim may have no existence. It is often assumed, indeed it is the official assumption of the churches and the divorce courts, that a gentleman and a lady cannot be alone together innocently. And that is manifest blazing nonsense, although many women have been stoned to death in the East and divorced in the West on the strength of it. On the other hand, the innocent and conventional people who regard the gallant adventures as crimes of so horrible a nature that only the most depraved and desperate characters engage in them, or would listen to advances in that direction without raising an alarm with the noisiest indignation, are clearly examples of the fact that most sections of society do not know how the other sections live. Industry is the most effective check on gallantry. Women may, as Napoleon said, be the occupation of the idle man, just as men are the preoccupation of the idle woman. But the mass of mankind is too busy and too poor for the long and expensive sieges which the professed libertine lays to virtue. Still, wherever there is idleness, or even a reasonable supply of elegant leisure, there is a good deal of coquetry and philandering. It is so much pleasanter to dance on the edge of a precipice than to go over it, that leisured society is full of people who spend a great part of their lives in flirtation, and conceal nothing but the humiliating secret that they have never gone any further. For there is no pleasing people in the manner of reputation in this department. Every insult is a flattery, every testimonial is a disparagement. Joseph is despised and promoted, Potiphar's wife admired and condemned. In short, you are never on solid ground until you get away from the subject altogether. There is a continual and irreconcilable conflict between the natural and conventional sides of the case, between spontaneous human relations between independent men and women on the one hand, and the property relation between husband and wife on the other, not to mention the confusion under the common name of love of a generous natural attraction and interest with the murderous jealousy that fastens on and clings to its mate, especially a hated mate, as a tiger fastens on a carcass. And the confusion is natural, for these extremes are extremes of the same passion, and most cases lie somewhere on the scale between them, and are so complicated by ordinary likes and dislikes, by incidental wounds to vanity or gratifications of it, and by class feeling, that A will be jealous of B and not of C, and will tolerate infidelities on the part of D, whilst being furiously angry when they are committed by E. The convention of jealousy. That jealousy is independent of sex is shown by its intensity in children, and the fact that very jealous people are jealous of everybody without regard to relationship or sex, and cannot bear to hear the person they love speak favourably of anyone under any circumstances. Many women, for instance, are much more jealous of their husbands, mothers and sisters than of unrelated women whom they suspect him of fancying. But it is seldom possible to disentangle the two passions in practice. Besides, jealousy is an inculcated passion, forced by society on people in whom it would not occur spontaneously. In Briot's Bourgeois au Champ, the benevolent hero finds himself detested by the neighbouring peasants and farmers, not because he preserves game and sets man-traps for poachers, and defends his legal rights over his land to the extremest point of unsocial savagery, but because, being an amiable and public-spirited person, he refuses to do all this, and thereby offends and disparages the sense of property in his neighbours. The same thing is true of matrimonial jealousy. The man who does not at least pretend to feel it and behave as badly as if he really felt it is despised and insulted. And many a man has shot or stabbed a friend, or been shot or stabbed by him in a duel, or disgraced himself and ruined his own wife in a divorce scandal against his conscience, against his instinct, and to the destruction of his home, solely because society conspired to drive him to keep his own lower morality in countenance in this miserable and undignified manner. Morality is confused in such matters. In an elegant plutocracy, a jealous husband is regarded as a boor. Among the tradesmen who supply that plutocracy with its meals, a husband who is not jealous, and who refrains from assailing his rival with his fists, is regarded as a ridiculous, contemptible, and cowardly cuckold. And the labouring class is divided into the respectable section, which takes the tradesman's view, and the disreputable section, which enjoys the licence of the plutocracy without its money, creeping below the law as its exemplars prance above it, cutting down all expenses of respectability and even decency, and frankly accepting squalor and disrepute as the price of anarchic self-indulgence. The conflict between Malvolio and Satobi, between the Marquis and the bourgeois, the cavalier and the Puritan, the ascetic and the voluptuary, goes on continually, and goes on not only between class and individual, but in the selfsame breast, in a series of reactions and revulsions, in which the irresistible becomes the unbearable, and the unbearable the irresistible, until none of us can say what our characters really are in this respect. The missing data of a scientific natural history of marriage. Of one thing I am persuaded. We shall never attain to a reasonable, healthy public opinion on sex questions until we offer, as the data for that opinion, our actual conduct and our real thoughts, instead of a moral fiction which we agree to call virtuous conduct, and which we then, and here comes in the mischief, pretend is our conduct and our thoughts. If the result were that we all believed one another to be better than we really are, there would be something to be said for it. But the actual result appears to be a monstrous exaggeration of the power and continuity of sexual passion. The whole world shares the fate of Lucrezia Borgia, who, though she seems on investigation to have been quite a suitable wife for a modern British bishop, has been invested by the popular historical imagination with all the extravagances of a Messalina or a Cenci. Writers of belles-lettres who are rash enough to admit that their whole life is not one constant preoccupation with adored members of the opposite sex, and who even countenance La Rochefoucauld's remark that very few people would ever imagine themselves to be in love if they had never read anything about it, are gravely declared to be abnormal or physically defective by critics of crushing unadventurousness and domestication. French authors of saintly temperament are forced to include in their retinue countesses of ardent complexion, with whom they are supposed to live in sin. Sentimental controversies on the subject are endless, but they are useless because nobody tells the truth. Rousseau did it by an extraordinary effort, aided by a superhuman faculty for human natural history, but the result was curiously disconcerting, because though the facts were so conventionally shocking that people felt that they ought to matter a great deal, they actually mattered very little, and even at that everybody pretends not to believe him. Artificial retribution. The worst of that is that busybodies with perhaps rather more than a normal taste for mischief are continually trying to make negligible things matter as much in fact as they do in convention by deliberately inflicting injuries, sometimes atrocious injuries, on the parties concerned. Few people have any knowledge of the savage punishments that are legally inflicted for aberrations and absurdities to which no sanely instructed community would call any attention. We create an artificial morality, and consequently an artificial conscience, by manufacturing disastrous consequences for events which, left to themselves, would do very little harm, sometimes not any, and be forgotten in a few days. But the artificial morality is not therefore to be condemned offhand. In many cases it may save mischief instead of making it. For example, though the hanging of a murderer is the duplication of a murder, yet it may be less murderous than leaving the matter to be settled by blood feud or vendetta. As long as human nature insists on revenge, the official organization and satisfaction of revenge by the state may also be its minimization. The mischief begins when the official revenge persists after the passion it satisfied has died out of the race. Stoning a woman to death in the East because she has ventured to marry again after being deserted by her husband may be more merciful than allowing her to be mobbed to death, but the official stoning or burning of an adulteress in the West would be an atrocity, because few of us hate an adulteress to the extent of desiring such a penalty, or of being prepared to take the law into our own hands if it were withheld. Now, what applies to this extreme case also applies in due degrees to the other cases. Offences in which sex is concerned are often needlessly magnified by penalties, ranging from various forms of social ostracism to long sentences of penal servitude, which would seem to be monstrously disproportionate to the real feeling against them if the removal of both the penalties and the taboo on their discussion made it possible for us to ascertain their real prevalence and estimation. Fortunately, there is one outlet for the truth. We are permitted to discuss in jest what we may not discuss in earnest. A serious comedy about sex is taboo. A farcical comedy is privileged. The favourite subject of farcical comedy. This little piece which follows this preface accordingly takes the form of a farcical comedy, because it is a contribution to the very extensive dramatic literature which takes as its special department the gallantries of married people. The stage has been preoccupied by such affairs for centuries, not only in the jesting vein of Restoration comedy and Palais Royal farce, but in the more tragically turned adulteries of the Parisian school, which dominated the stage until Ibsen put them out of their countenance and relegated them to their proper place as articles of commerce. Their continued vogue in that department maintains the tradition that adultery is the dramatic subject par excellence, and indeed, a play that is not about adultery is not a play at all. I was considered a heresiarch of the most extravagant kind when I expressed my opinion at the outset of my career as a playwright that adultery is the dullest of themes on the stage, and that from Francesca and Poirot down to the latest guilty couple of the school of Dumas fils, the romantic adulterers have all been intolerable bores. The pseudo-sex play. Later on, I had the occasion to point out to the defenders of sex as the proper theme of drama that though they were right in ranking sex as an intensely interesting subject, they were wrong in assuming that sex is an indispensable motive in popular plays. The plays of Molière are, like the novels of the Victorian epoch or Don Quixote, nearly as sexless as anything not absolutely inhuman can be. And some of Shakespeare's plays are sexually on a par with the census. They contain women as well as men, and that is all. This had to be admitted, but it was still assumed that the plays of the 19th century Parisian school are, in contrast with the sexless masterpieces, saturated with sex, and this I strenuously denied. A play about the convention that a man should fight a duel or come to fisticuffs with his wife's lover if she has one, or the convention that he should strangle her like Othello, or turn her out of the house and never see her or allow her to see her children again, or the convention that she should never be spoken to again by any decent person and should finally drown herself, or the convention that persons involved in scenes of recrimination or confession by these conventions should call each other certain abusive names and describe their conduct as guilty and frail and so on. All these may provide material for very effective plays, but such plays are not dramatic studies of sex. One might as well say that Romeo and Juliet is a dramatic study of pharmacy, because the catastrophe is brought upon through an apothecary. Duels are not sex. Divorce cases are not sex. The trade unionism of married women is not sex. Only the most insignificant fraction of the gallantries of married people produce any of the conventional results, and plays occupied wholly with the conventional results are therefore utterly unsatisfying as sex plays, however interesting they may be as plays of intrigue and plot puzzles. The world is finding this out rapidly. The Sunday papers, which in the days when they appealed almost exclusively to the lower middle class were crammed with police intelligence, and more especially with divorce and murder cases, now lay no stress on them. And police papers, which confined themselves entirely to such matters and were once eagerly read, have perished through the essential dullness of their topics. And yet the interest in sex is stronger than ever. In fact, the literature that has driven out the journalism of the divorce courts is a literature occupied with sex to an extent and with an intimacy and frankness that would have seemed utterly impossible to Thackeray or Dickens if they had been told that the change would complete itself within 50 years of their own time. Art and morality. It is ridiculous to say, as inconsiderate amateurs of the arts do, that art has nothing to do with morality. What is true is that the artist's business is not that of the policeman, and that such factitious consequences and put-up jobs as divorces and executions, and the detective operations that lead up to them, are no essential parts of life, though, like poisons and buttered slides and red-hot pokers, they provide material for plenty of thrilling or amusing stories suited to people who are incapable of any interest in psychology. But the fine artists must keep the policeman out of his studies of sex and studies of crime. It is by clinging nervously to the policeman that most of the pseudo-sex plays convince me that the writers of either never had any serious personal experience of their ostensible subject, or else have never conceived it possible that the stage door present the phenomena of sex as they appear in nature. The limits of stage presentation. But the stage presents much more shocking phenomena than those of sex. There is, of course, a sense in which you cannot present sex on the stage, just as you cannot present murder. Macbeth must no more really kill Duncan than he must himself really be slain by Macduff. But the feelings of a murderer can be expressed in a certain artistic convention, and a carefully prearranged sword exercise can be gone through with sufficient pretence of earnestness to be accepted by the willing imaginations of the younger spectators as a desperate combat. The tragedy of love has been presented on the stage in the same way. In Tristan and Isolde, the curtain does not, as in Romeo and Juliet, rise with the lark. The whole night of love is played before the spectators. The lovers do not discuss marriage in an elegantly sentimental way. They utter the visions and feelings that come to lovers at the supreme moments of their love, totally forgetting that there are such things in the world as husbands and lawyers and duelling codes and theories of sin and notions of propriety and all the other irrelevancies which provide hackneyed and bloodless material for our so-called plays of passion. Pruderies of the French stage. To all stage productions there are limits. If Macduff were to stab Macbeth, the spectacle would be intolerable, and even the pretence which we allow on our stage is ridiculously destructive to the illusion of the scene. Yet pugilists and gladiators will actually fight and kill in public without sham, even as a spectacle for money. But no sober couple of lovers of any delicacy could endure to be watched. We in England, accustomed to consider the French stage much more licentious than the British, are always surprised and puzzled when we learn, as we may do any day if we come within reach of such information, that French actors are often scandalized by what they consider the indecency of the English stage, and that French actresses who desire a greater license in appealing to the sexual instincts than the French stage allows them, learn and establish themselves on the English stage. The German and Russian stages are in the same relation to the French, and perhaps more or less all the Latin stages. The reason is that, partly from a want of respect for the theatre, partly from a sort of respect for art in general, which moves them to accord moral privileges to artists, partly from the very objectionable tradition that the realm of art is Alsatia, and the contemplation of works of art a holiday from the burden of virtue, partly because French prudery does not attach itself to the same points of behaviour as British prudery, and has a different code of the mentionable and the unmentionable. And for many other reasons, the French tolerate plays which are never performed in England until they have been spoiled by a process of bowdlerization. Yet French taste is more fastidious than ours as to the exhibition and treatment on the stage of the physical incidents of sex. On the French stage, a kiss is as obvious a convention as the thrust under the arm by which Macduff runs Macbeth through. It is even a purposely unconvincing convention, the actors rather insisting that it shall be impossible for any spectator to mistake a stage kiss for a real one. In England, on the contrary, realism is carried to the point at which nobody except the two performers can perceive that the caress is not genuine. And here the English stage is certainly right, for whatever question there arises as to what incidents are proper for representation on the stage or not, my experience as a playgoer leaves me in no doubt that once it is decided to represent an incident, it will be offensive, no matter whether it be a prayer or a kiss, unless it is presented with a convincing appearance of sincerity. Our disillusive scenery. For example, the main objection to the use of elusive scenery. In most modern plays, scenery is not elusive. Everything visible is as real as in your drawing room, is that it is unconvincing, whilst the imaginary scenery with which the audience provides a platform or tribune like the Elizabethan stage or the Greek stage used by Sophocles is quite convincing. In fact, the more scenery you have, the less illusion you produce. The wise playwright, when he cannot get absolute reality of presentation, goes to the other extremes and aims at atmosphere and suggestion of mood rather than at direct simulative illusion. The theatre, as I first knew it, was a place of wings and flats, which destroyed both atmosphere and illusion. This was tolerated, and even intensely enjoyed, but not in the least because nothing better was possible, for all the devices employed in the productions of Mr. Granville Barker or Max Reinhardt or the Moscow Art Theatre were equally available for the Colley-Cibber and Garrick, except the intensity of our artificial light. When Garrick played Richard II in slashed trunk hose and plumes, it was not because he believed that the Plantagenets dressed like that, or because the costumes could not have made him a 15th-century dress as easily as a nondescript combination of the state robes of George III, with such scraps of older fashions as seemed to playgoers for some reason to be romantic. The charm of the theatre in those days was its make-believe. It has that charm still, not only for the amateurs, who are happiest when they are most unnatural and impossible and absurd, but for audiences as well. I have seen performances of my own plays which were to me far wilder burlesques than Sheridan's Critic or Buckingham's Rehearsal. Yet they have produced sincere laughter and tears such as the most finished metropolitan productions have failed to elicit. Fielding was entirely right when he represented Partridge as intensely enjoying the performance of the king in Hamlet, because anybody could see that the king was an actor, and resenting Garrick's Hamlet because it might have been a real man. Yet we have only to look at portraits of Garrick to see that his performances would nowadays seem almost as extravagantly stagey as his costumes. In our day, Culve's intensely real Carmen never pleased the mob as much as the obvious fancy ball masquerading of suburban young ladies in the same character. Holding the mirror up to nature. Theatrical art begins as the holding up to nature of a distorting mirror. In this phase, it pleases people who are childish enough to believe that they can see what they look like and what they are when they look in a true mirror. Naturally, they think that a true mirror can teach them nothing. Only by giving them back some monstrous image can the mirror amuse them or terrify them. It is not until they grow up to the point at which they learn that they know very little about themselves, and that they do not see themselves in a true mirror as other people see them, that they become consumed with curiosity as to what they really are like, and begin to demand that the stage shall be a mirror of such accuracy and intensity of illumination that they shall be able to get glimpses of their real selves in it, and also learn a little how they appear to other people. For audiences of this highly developed class, sex can no longer be ignored or conventionalized or distorted by the playwright who makes the mirror. The old sentimental extravagances and the old grossnesses are of no further use to him. Don Giovanni and Zerlina are not gross. Tristan and Isolde are not extravagant or sentimental. They say and do nothing that you cannot bear to hear and see, and yet they give you, the one pair briefly and slightly, the other fully and deeply, what passes in the minds of lovers. The love depicted may be that of a philosophic adventurer tempting an ignorant country girl, or of a tragically serious poet entangled with a woman of noble capacity in a passion which has become for them the reality of the whole universe. No matter. The thing is dramatized, and dramatized directly, not talked about as something that happened before the curtain rose, or that will happen after it falls. Farcical comedy shirking its subject. Now, if all of this can be done in the key of tragedy and philosophic comedy, it can, I have always contended, be done in the key of farcical comedy, and Overruled is a trifling experiment in that manner. Conventional farcical comedies are always finally tedious, because the heart of them, the inevitable conjugal infidelity, is always evaded. Even its consequences are evaded. Mr. Granville Barker has pointed out rightly that if the third acts of our farcical comedies dared to describe the consequences that would follow from the first and second in real life, they would end as squalid tragedies. And in my opinion, they would be greatly improved thereby even as entertainments. For I have never seen a 3-act farcical comedy without being bored and tired by the third act, and observing that the rest of the audience were in the same condition, though they were not vigilantly introspective enough to find that out, and were apt to blame one another, especially the husbands and wives, for their crossness. But it is happily by no means true that conjugal infidelities always produce tragic consequences, or that they need produce even the unhappiness which they often do produce. Besides, the more momentous the consequences, the more interesting become the impulses and imaginations and reasonings, if any, of the people who disregard them. If I had an opportunity of conversing with the ghost of an executed murderer, I have no doubt he would begin to tell me eagerly about his trial, with the names of the distinguished ladies and gentlemen who honoured him with their presence on that occasion, and then about his execution, all of which would bore me exceedingly. I should say, "My dear sir, such manufactured ceremonies do not interest me in the least. I know how a man is tried, and how he is hanged. I should have had you killed in a much less disgusting, hypocritical, and unfriendly manner if the matter had been in my hands. What I want to know about is the murder. How did you feel when you committed it? Why did you do it? What did you say to yourself about it? If, like most murderers, you had not been hanged, would you have committed other murders? Did you really dislike the victim, or did you want his money? Or did you murder a person whom you did not dislike, and from whose death you had nothing to gain, merely for the sake of murdering? If so, can you describe the charm to me? Does it come upon you periodically, or is it chronic? Has curiosity anything to do with it? I would ply him with all manner of questions to find out what murder is really like, and I should not be satisfied until I had realized that I too might commit a murder, or else that there is some specific quality present in a murderer and lacking in me, and if so, what that quality is. In just the same way, I want the unfaithful husband or the unfaithful wife in a farcical comedy not to bother me with their divorce cases or the stratagems they employ to avoid a divorce case, but to tell me how and why married couples are unfaithful. I don't want to hear the lies they tell one another to conceal what they have done, but the truths they tell one another when they have to face what they have done without concealment or excuse. No doubt prudent and considerate people conceal such adventures when they can, from those who are most likely to be wounded by them, but it is not to be presumed that, when found out, they necessarily disgrace themselves by irritating lies and transparent subterfuges. My playlet, which I offer as a model to all future writers of farcical comedy, may now, I hope, be read without shock. I may just add that Mr. Sibthorpe Juno's view that morality demands not that we should behave morally, an impossibility to our sinful nature, but that we shall not attempt to defend our immoralities, is a standard view in England, and was advanced in all seriousness by an earnest and distinguished British moralist shortly after the first performance of Overruled. My objection to that aspect of the doctrine of original sin is that no necessary and inevitable operation of human nature can reasonably be regarded as sinful at all, and that a morality which assumes the contrary is an absurd morality, and can be kept in countenance only by hypocrisy. When people were ashamed of sanitary problems and refused to face them, leaving them to solve themselves clandestinely in dirt and secrecy, the solution arrived at was the Black Death. A similar policy as to sex problems has solved itself by an even worse plague than the Black Death, and the remedy for that is not salvarsan but sound moral hygiene, the first foundation of which is the discontinuance of our habit of telling not only the comparatively harmless lies that we know we ought not to tell, but the ruinous lies that we foolishly think we ought to tell. End of Preface to Overruled.